Welcome to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. I'm Mike Roberts, and with me is Bill Barley, our storyteller and tour guide for gold, silver, and who knows what other kinds of things. We've been to Sandon before, but I always love it when we talk about the magnates, the captains of industry.
Yeah.
Who are we talking about today?
Well, we're talking about one individual, Mike, who was called the King of Sandon, or the King of the Silver City, which Sandon was known as. He was a Virginian. He came from an aristocratic Southern family. And he was, I think, and I think perhaps rightly labeled, the richest man in the Kootenays, at least at one juncture. His name was John Morgan Harris, and he lived in that area virtually for over 60 years.
Okay. John Morgan Harris, the subject of tonight's Gold Trails and Ghost Towns when we come back from this break. Welcome back to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Mike Roberts with Bill Barley, and we're talking today about a captain of industry, John Morgan Harris. But what is this southern gentleman from Virginia doing in Sandon?
Well, he didn't start in Sandon, Mike. He drifted west with a lot of other people after the Civil War, and he had some money in his pocket. He ends up in Wallace, Idaho, which is a very interesting area because it's an old mining town. He comes in there when Wallace is just getting on the map. He establishes a real estate empire there, Mike, and he builds the racetrack. He's a man about town. He's a ladies' man, and but something goes wrong. We don't know what happens in Wallace. But he does sell out all his holdings in Wallace, and he decides to head north over the Canadian line, which is rather interesting. And he comes over the Canadian line with probably around $15,000 or $20,000, which is a big stake in the 1890s. He heads for Canada in 1892. He heads for the heart of the silver country. And the heart of the silver country is a fledgling camp called Sandon. And Sandon is eventually become the great town of the silvery Slocan.
Now, we've got this is an early artist's rendering of what you could find in Sandon. It's a great thing because it shows the nature, the lay of the land, and it shows where all of the various components were.
Yeah, this is a very, very fine print, Mike. And the reason is because it shows you where Sandon is situated, and it's surrounded in concentric circles by mines. Some at the lower level, some at medium level, some at high levels. Some of those mines at the 7,000-foot level. And the richest mines of all, the Payne and the Noble Five and the American Boy and the Slocan Star and another one called the Rico, they're very rich. Some of them are producing 2,000 ounces to the ton. Now, John Morgan Harris comes in. He's going to establish an empire, but he decides to take a chance on one property. He takes a chance on a property he calls the Rico, R-E-C-E-A-U, which is interesting. Later, that name is changed to R-E-C-O. Now, virtually all of the Americans who are coming into town are mining magnates, and they all come from the state of Washington. And what they do is they actually take their mining company and they establish it in the state of Washington, usually in Spokane.
And because Washington, I guess Spokane's the closest major city with some clout. The courts are there, registries there.
Yeah.
This isn't one of Harris's companies, but it does show there's the state of Washington noted up there.
Yeah.
And
this is 1897.
The Wonderful Group.
The Wonderful Group, yeah. Quite a well-known mine in that Sandon area. So that's typical of some of the mines. Now what happens, of course, is that he hits it on the Rico. It's narrow vein, but extremely rich. Thousands of ounces per ton. And John Morgan Harris, this is the beginning of his mining empire. And he hits it so well that in those first years, in 96 and 97, he is making, Mike, between $100,000 and $200,000 a year. Now, by today's standards, that is not a lot. But by the standards of 1896 and 1897, when a depression is settling over the country, it's staggering. You multiply that by 40, probably by 40. That's right. So he'd been making $4 million a year, which means now he not only established the Rico mine, Mike, he goes downtown and he builds himself a brand new hotel called the Rico Hotel. He shortens the name to R-E-C-O. He also establishes the Rico Milling and Mining Company. Rico Avenue is in early Sandon, in the 1890s Sandon, and the only place he deviates, he establishes the Slocan Power Company.
So he was also building the utilities that would serve the town and all his needs.
Oh, sure he was.
Well, like $4 million a year. I guess he had the capacity for this. This is, I mean, all through. He was an integrated corporation. He did a little of everything very well.
Yeah, he did, and he's a very young man. Remember this, in 1894, in his early 20s. And here's a photograph of John Morgan Harris as he looked around 1894 or 1896. Probably this photograph is taken in 1896.
Not a big man.
No, he isn't a big man. He's quite small, but he's very vigorous. He's very analytical, extremely sharp, an intelligent human being is what he is. And he's a kind of guy that he had a certain charisma or charm, whatever you want to call it, and people remembered this guy right from the first time they met him. And he really made an impact on people. I found it very, very interesting.
I remember a man who made $4 million a year, too. That would be a very memorable component.
Oh, sure.
And was he well-liked, in addition to being just the kind of person you wanted to attach yourself to?
Well, I've got most of his papers. I don't think he had any very close personal friends. He had two partners, one guy called Texas Kelly, and Texas Kelly was his partner, equal partner in the Slocan Power Company and in his mine and everything else. But eventually he is, I think, eased out. And then another individual comes in, Clara Smith, and he becomes a very, very minor partner of John Morgan Harris's for years.
Now, in a town like Sandon, population about this time what?
About 2,000, Mike.
So he would have the hotel. I mean, the Rico Hotel. Yeah. Would it be state-of-the-art, 1896 sometime?
Sure. Now here's a picture of the Rico Hotel, and this is how it looked in early Sandon. This is pre-fire Sandon, and this is how Sandon itself looks when you look down the main street of Sandon in 1896 or 97. And this is a long, narrow main street right out of sight. Those buildings carry right out of sight. Very, very fascinating town. Typical of the mining towns of the Pacific Slope, Mike.
So he's got the hotel, he's got the milling company, he's got a mining company, he's got the utility company, and it's rolling in.
That's right, but a few clouds on the horizon. Several things happen. First thing is, the price of silver from 1893 begins a gradual decline. And it starts to decline steadily. Not like gold. Gold's on the gold standard. But silver goes down, down, down. This is bound to affect all the silver producers, bound to affect the miners in the area, which it does. Second thing that happens, Mike, is 1898 rush in late 97, early 98 into the Yukon. Draws a lot of miners and draws some mine owners out of Sandon.
Even though they're still, I mean, the silver may be slipping, but there's still rich mines there, aren't there?
Sure.
Sandon's still rich.
Oh, yeah, sure it is. It's still doing very well and becomes an incorporated city in 1898. And so, you know, it has 24 hotels, it has scores of businesses, it has 2 railroads, you know, the K&S and the N&S, and they're doing quite well. But what happens then, on May the 4th, 1900, the first serious blow to Sandon, which I alluded to in one other program, actually, and it's the fire of May the 4th, 1900. And what happens, it sweeps down Rico Avenue and virtually wipes out the entire main street. It leaves on the other side, it leaves one major building that John Morgan Harris still owned. And that major building actually was the Rico Barn. Now, he wasn't about to waste any money. The rest of the town is wiped out. John Morgan Harris owns the one building that is still standing, the one major building. He turns it around and puts a front on the barn, which is strange because it's a strange-looking building.
It's kind of tilted, isn't it?
That's right. That becomes the Rico Hotel.
The second Rico Hotel.
The second Rico Hotel. Rico Hotel number 2, and still a very, very fine hotel. When you ate in the Rico, you ate with dishes like this, Mike.
John Morgan Harris didn't miss a chance. I mean, he knew he was in Canada. He was still an American, of course, but he knew that this would have the desired effect on the kind of clientele he wanted to approach.
That's right, and the cutlery was also engraved Rico, which is interesting. And I find it kind of fascinating because this guy was really quick off the mark. He established himself very quickly. He also
the smoke isn't out of the valley yet, right? I mean, the place has burned down, and because remember the fire was what, the 4th?
4th of May.
On August the 30th, 1900, he's inviting everybody to the opening of his new Rico Hotel.
Yeah.
And look at the script. Yourself and friends cordially invited to attend.
Yes, his English was not, or at least the printer's English was not perfect. But we're a little late for the invitation, but of course, he also, right next, virtually just up the block from the Rico, he establishes another complex, which is called the Virginia, departure from the Rico Mike. He calls this one the Virginia after his native state, and it is the headquarters of his mining operation, of his milling operation, of the Sandon Waterworks and Power Company, and all the rest of it.
So Action Central, the Virginia block.
Sure it is.
Okay. What's this little Megillah here? Looks like was John Morgan Harris prone to doing his own with sort of law keeping?
Well, yes, he was. Now, this is a marvelous piece, and it's actually from the John Morgan Harris's collection. I picked it up some years ago. I purchased it from Alma Harris, and it's shot-loaded, and it's still corked. And if anyone got out of hand in a poker game, and remember, they had high-stakes poker games in Sandon. It was a wide-open game, thousands of dollars on the table, Mike, when thousands of dollars was a lot of money. So he would use poker chips like this.
Now, these are pretty snazzy, too, and not only did he have good flatware and cutlery and everything, but these are they're not ivory.
No.
I think we've seen some ivory ones, but these are pretty good quality.
Those are very, very fine quality composition chip. Now, they're a stock chip, but certainly that first one you showed was quite unusual. You don't see that stock chip hardly anywhere at all.
Now, Sandon, as a community, did it all regenerate as well as Harris managed to make his holdings regenerate?
No, Harris hangs on. Sandon's a tough town, and Harris has another reversal. And the other reversal is this. The Rico was such a rich ore body that other miners were inclined to tap it. And it meant that you had the ore body vertically, but that wasn't proven. There was what they called the apex law. And so some very, very interesting miners called the Whites out of Spokane come in, and they begin, he is sure they're tapping his ore at the lower level. So he finds out that they are tapping his ore. Now, they're a very powerful family. He takes them to court. It goes to county court.
This is county in Canada? Or
county in British Columbia.
Yeah.
And then it goes to Supreme Court of British Columbia. Then it goes to the Supreme Court of Canada. And finally, it goes to the highest elevation of all. It goes to the Privy Council in England. And the interesting thing about this court case was terrifically expensive. It carried on for years. They had experts coming in from all around the world. It was a landmark case, Mike. Really a landmark case. In the end, and his lawyers are sending him bills of $10,000 at a time. That's equivalent to $200,000 or $400,000 a day, somewhere between those, probably 40 times as much. So they're sending him bills like this, $5,000. We want $5,000 more by return. We want $10,000 more. Please wire it, and so on. So he goes on. He's very tenacious in the courts. He wins the case, but loses the battle, Mike.
In what way?
Well, the Whites, I think, were prepared that they were going to lose the case. So then they bring him into a new company. He hangs out of the RICO.
They bring him in. They fight with him.
As part of the money they would have owed him. You see?
I see. Okay.
So
we can't pay you cash, Mr. Harris, but come into our company, sir.
We'll bring you into the silversmith, and he's brought in on an equal basis, evidently. And I haven't got all the papers, I've got some of them, to give me a reading of it. And what they do, once they get him in, they start watering down the shares.
What does that mean?
Well, that means that we'll say that 100,000 shares were issued at first, and John Morgan Harris would get 50,000, and the Whites would get the other 50,000. Well, then they had it drawn up so that they could issue more shares. They probably issued 1 million more. So if they issued 1 million more, there's 1,100,000 shares outstanding. He only has 10,000 of those. He has 9% of the company instead of 50%. Now, I don't know those are the exact figures, but something like that.
That's how the deed's done.
That's right. He never forgives the Whites. He never forgives the Whites till his dying day.
And that's about 1910, but I've got a document in my hands here that shows John Morgan Harris buying the Silversmith Mines Limited, which is White's operation, for $1 in 1921.
Yeah, I think what happened. The mine was pretty well gutted, not entirely, Mike, but pretty well gutted between 1910 and 1920. And then, for some reason, Harris buys that property, and I don't really know the reasons why. I haven't got all the details of that. But we do know that he was still active in mining. We do know that he still owns the RICO. Now he owns the Silversmith. And not only that, the RICO, at one time, he valued at $1 million. And he had it on for sale on the New York Stock Exchange for $1 million. He had some nibbles, but no bites. But as the years go on, the price goes down. He is taking the best ore out. He's gutting the RICO as time goes on.
Now, this is a strange case. Here's a young man who's a high roller, hard-nosed businessman, gambler, and yet he seems stuck in Sandon. I mean, he seems to have attached himself and his fortunes to this town.
Oh, sure he is. And he is not finished yet. Despite Sandon's future, which looks a little gloomy, John Morgan Harris is not finished.
All right. Come back in just a second, because John Morgan Harris has 30 years or more so to do, and we'll do that right after this break. Welcome back to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns, talking about John Morgan Harris. Arrives in Sandon, as we said, at the age of 22 back in the 1890s. we're now in the 1930s. He's a 50-year-old man stuck in a descending mining camp.
Actually, in the 1930s, he's just over 60 years old, Mike, and he is, the mining camp has gone down, but he hasn't given up. And he's a fascinating guy in that he still retains many interests, and amongst them, really, he's still interested in young women. And he is a man of some substance, and he advertises for a woman to help him in the Rico Hotel and all the holdings of John Morgan Harris. And interesting because he sits upstairs in the Virginia block behind a curtain that is partly shielding him, and one of his managers leads these various women past up the boardwalk, past the Virginia. But the manager casually looks up at the window, and if Harris goes like this, the girl catches the next train out of town. Finally, he leads a young girl up there whose name is Alma. She's 26 years old. John Morgan Harris is 63 years old, and Harris goes like this. She is then hired on. Within a few months, the 63-year-old marries the 26-year-old.
And Alma becomes Mrs. John Morgan Harris.
Yes, very voluptuous woman. Really made waves in that Slocan country, right from Casler right down to New Denver. And so John Morgan Harris marries her in the early 30s. They remain married right through the I think the descent of Sandon. And Sandon does have the occasional time when there's occasional mining operations come back, even in the late 30s and of course right through the 1940s. But by the 1950s, John Morgan Harris is in his 80s. And in 1954, something else happened which I think was indicative, Mike, and it was this. There was a fire started in Sandon accidentally, probably through faulty wiring, and it starts, and they think it's going to sweep the whole town. Eugene Peterson, who was there at the time, and some other men grab the old hose reel, and they come running down the street with it, and Harris is sitting there watching the progress of the fire, and he says, "Don't bother, boys, the town's finished anyway."
So Harris has now even given up by 1954, 84 years old.
I think so. I think he has given up, and of course they put the fire out, but Harris dies in that year. Strangely, a man who stayed with the town for over 60 years, Mike, he decides not to be buried in that Slocan country. And he, still a man of had amassed a considerable fortune, had kept most of it too, or much of it. And he is buried back in his native Virginia. His recently bereaved widow goes back with him. They read the will, and they find out that she receives precisely $1.
He has no love for her. Obviously, she wasn't the woman he'd hoped she'd be.
I assume that was the case, because all the fortune that he had, he left to one of his nieces.
Now, there's a spittoon here, which I guess is a standard piece of mining company fare, but there's also a list. Who made up this list? Well,
that list is kind of interesting. I bought all the Harris papers, of course, and this list is from Alma Harris after she became a widow, and she decides to sell off all the holdings and all the furniture and all the contents of each of these buildings. And these are some of the things she sold. She sold a roll-top desk, which was a beauty for, I don't know what the price is there, Mike. It's probably right up at the top.
$45.
$45.
And spittoons, 5 spittoons for $5.
$1 each. You couldn't replace these today for hundreds of dollars.
So that's a remarkable little list to have.
Isn't it?
It speaks volumes about how she now had to, after being married to the richest man in the West, in British Columbia.
Well, at one time he was. Certainly he wasn't in the 1950s, but he still had a relatively large fortune. And suddenly she is thrown back on her own resources. And so what happens, of course, is that she's thrown back on her own resources, and Sandon itself then goes under the second great catastrophe, the second great disaster to befall Sandon, and this is the flood of 1955. Carpenter Creek actually jams, it's jammed, and it comes through in a surge, and it wipes out much of the business district. Not all of it, Mike, but you can see from these photos here what happened right after the fire. And these particular photographs are taken immediately after the flood.
And they had built the main street of town right over Carpenter Creek, so when it wiped out, the main street, it wiped out everything there was.
Yeah, it wiped out all the north side and part of the south side. Now, the interesting thing, Mike, is this, though, that it wasn't entirely wiped out. Some of those buildings were still standing. The Rico was still standing. The Miners Union Block was still standing. The Burns Building was still standing. The Virginia was still standing. And many of those were later taken by salvagers from the area, which is unfortunate. So really, that is the demise of Sandon itself.
Now, you bought the Virginia Block, did you not?
Yeah, I bought...
You had a real fondness for Sandon as a potential historic site.
Yeah, I did. I had a fondness for the whole area, Mike, and I find that there's an ambience or a mood in that area that other areas in the province have, but it's particularly attractive. For instance, when I drive up that road from New Denver, which is still a very, very scenic town, and you drive up the road towards Sandon, you can look southward and across the Carpenter Creek Valley, and there you'll see what I'm showing in this particular photograph here. There's a cluster of mine buildings there, and that was originally the Queen Bess Mine. And this next shot shows some of the other buildings that were built around it and were still standing a few years ago. And what happened there in the 1920s, a guy called Clarence Cunningham came in, and Clarence Cunningham was a leaser. One of dozens and scores of leasers in that Slocan country.
He's a man just taking a chance.
Sure. He's going to look at old properties. He goes down to the bank in New Denver, and he said, I want to buy that Queen Bess property. Well, they're pleased to get rid of it. They have a bill owing on that of $30,000, and the oil was gone as far as they were concerned. And they were further convinced, because two Swedes put in a drift in there, a tunnel in there, 1,200 feet long, didn't hit any ore at all. So Cunningham goes in there. They said, look, if you get it, pay us back the $30,000. Well, that's a great deal for him. He rustles up a little money for powder and a little bit for food, and he takes a couple of guys. They go up there, and they go in, and they start cross-cutting. And they cross-cut about 30 feet, and he comes out with $1.5 or $1.25 million worth of silver ore. And he then is not known just as Clarence Cunningham. He is Lucky Clarence Cunningham.
I would say so.
Yeah.
That was in the 20s, though. Is anything happening in Sandon now, mining?
Yeah, surprisingly, Mike, and maybe not surprisingly, because when you look at that area, it's been associated with mining for almost a century now. And a company came back in there several decades ago called Silver Ledge, and they're now known as Kamkosha. They went into an old property called the Ruth. And the Ruth Hope property has produced for them millions and millions of ounces of high-grade silver.
And Ruth, this is again that beautiful old illustration that we used at the beginning of the program, and sure enough, Ruth is back in business.
Yeah, and when you look at all those hills and the cascading tailings dumps all around there, you sometimes wonder, I think there's still significant bodies of kidney-shaped ore bodies in that particular area that will produce high-grade silver in the future.
But silver has to go to what kind of price before people will start mining it again?
I would think it's very low price now, Mike. I would think it would probably have to go to $15 an ounce.
Before you get that kind of thing. Remarkable story of John Morgan Harris, started out at 22 and became one of the richest men in the Kootenays. Thanks for joining us. See you next time.